fighting hordes of people to try to find the toy that his kid wants. Or I think of the shenanigans of the Griswold Christmas family. Right? That doesn't look very peaceful, right? The squirrel running around in the house, the burned Christmas tree, the fried pussycat. These movies are artistic ways of showing us the frustrations that can creep up during this time of year. Maybe it's visiting in-laws and the families that throw off our routines or tell us how to do things the right way. Or people pushing and shoving to get the shelves clear before someone else can get there. Depression goes up, airports get backed up. That's not peaceful, right? How is the peace of the Christmas season so muddled with the frustrations and anger of the human spirit? We want to experience peace, but too often we've got all of these conflicts and disappointments and frustrations that go with it. And this type of chaos is direct opposition to the peace that Christ wants us to have. The good news of the gospel involves peace. In fact, Paul would write about peace to the Ephesians. In Ephesians 2, 16 and 17, it would say, "Together as one body, Christ reconciled both groups to God by means of his death." A lot of hostility towards each other. Two different groups, reconciled to God. Christ reconciled both groups to God by means of his death and reconciled to God, to bring people to God. And we need to be reminded of this. Much of the Bible is written by people who are surrounded by conflict and struggle. Much of the Old Testament accounts that we read, the Israelites are surrounded by nations who are sieging them. They're exiled to foreign countries. They are enslaved by powerful empires. The Old Testament writers are crying out to God for peace in times of war. They believed that God was faithful and that he would keep his promise, and so they waited for him to send rescue. So just like last week, we look at Isaiah again. Isaiah is full of prophecies of the coming Messiah. And just after he prophesies about hope coming in the darkness, then he records that verse that we read for the kids. Right? "You will break the yoke of their slavery and lift the heavy burden for their shoulders. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of heaven's army will make this happen." The verses in Isaiah 9. The promised peace will never end, he says. There is a break from slavery. The yoke of slavery will be lifted. The burden will be lifted off their shoulders. And many saw this as a physical peace. Remember what's going on when Isaiah is writing this. We said a little bit last week, they're surrounded by war. They fought with Aram. They fought with Judah, their own brothers. News of wars is their daily news. Right? Within 20 years of these verses, they're going to be conquered and they're going to be sent into exile by Assyria. The kingdom is crumbling and people want peace. God says they have heavy burdens. Their human leaders have failed them. Their government has failed them. But God's peace will reign. God's government will reign. The promise of God that's talked about by Isaiah, that's written about by Isaiah, is a coming ruler, a new government that will have no end. A child's going to be born, and he will be all these things. He will be a mighty God. He will be a prince of peace. He will be a wonderful counselor. All those things we want for our government rulers. Wonderful counselor, peace. This is not the reality when he writes this, but it gives them hope and it gives them peace that God's not forgotten them. No, it's no secret that we don't have peace around us. All you got to do is watch the news, read the news for a few minutes, and you see that there's struggle and there's pain all over the place. Israel, now, struggling, conflict, war. Ukraine, Sudan, lack of water, lack of food, violence and vitriol in our country on social media. Complete lack of confidence in our government. Something like 10% of people trust Congress. Sometimes we see it in our own families when people are at odds with one another. We live in a broken world. And we can relate to the Israelites' desire for a ruler to bring order to the chaos, to the brokenness. They screamed for peace, and so do we. And if we're honest, we long to see peace come. We long for a promise to be fulfilled. Well, hundreds of years after Isaiah writes these words, the promise begins to be fulfilled. Jesus comes to pass. And we hear about it from some people that are a bit of a surprise, actually. As we work backward from Simeon in the story, Simeon comes a few days after Jesus' birth, right? He comes into the picture 8 days later. We work backwards, we see the shepherds of Luke's gospel. These guys are very familiar to us, Luke's gospel, right? We look in Luke chapter 2, and it says, that night there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified, but the angel reassured them. Don't be afraid, he said. I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger. So there we have it, right? In the field outside, the shepherds are watching the flocks. Now, we see shepherds and we think cute little boys running around in nice little, cute little togas, right? And maybe there are pictures of that sometimes. But the shepherds of the near ancient East were manly men. They were rough, tough guys. And they were seen as some of the lowest of the low in their society. They were a nomadic group. They lived off the grid. They would find pastures for their sheep. They were single young men a lot of times without children. They didn't have attachments. They were not clean. They didn't smell good. They were a blue-collar crowd. Right? They worked hard, they worked long to make their living. They were considered second class and untrustworthy. And yet, these are the first people to hear the long-awaited announcement of the Messiah. An angel of the Lord comes to them, and he appears in the field, and the shepherd's first response is terror. Absolute terror. And they're fearful because the glory of the Lord shines around them in the dead of night. Like the dark countryside suddenly being filled with these unimaginable sights and sounds is not enough. The veil between our world and God's realm is momentarily split open. And Luke writes, the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. The glory of the Lord shows up. And this should have terrified them. This glory should have terrified them. The glory of the Lord rests on the cherubim in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies. And even Moses in Exodus 40 could no longer enter the tabernacle when God's glory is seated there. At the promised coming of God, at the birth of Jesus, the glory shines. The shepherds were rightly terrified. But being surrounded by God's glory does not have to be terrifying. And the first words the angels say to them, do not be afraid. Once they had reassured them, their comfort, their fear subsides. And these rough, unacceptable, unclean shepherds were okay to receive this message. They were accepted to view this spectacle. And there's a sense when we read the whole Christmas account that the hope, the peace, the joy, and the love that come with Christ are not just for the powerful. They're not for the people that have it all figured out. There's not for the people that are in power. It's for the ones who are scratching and clawing to make it. It's for everybody, everywhere. That's the message about peace, is the peace of Jesus is for everyone. The peace of Jesus is for everyone. Jesus would display this concept in his ministry. He would reach out to Gentiles. He would reach out to unclean people, even within his closest 12 followers. He would put a tax collector and a zealot together, and he would put them at the dinner table together, and they would eat a meal together, and he would say, get over your philosophical, political, and religious differences and just be with me, and be at peace. The first words spoken over the shepherds, do not be afraid, are words that he speaks to us. Though we're in a painful situation, though we have a diagnosis we don't like, though we're struggling in a relationship, do not be afraid. That despite whatever you've done or whoever you are, God's peace is for you. The angel brings great news of joy to all people, of all ages, of all classes, of all groups. And the one thing about Jesus' peace is he really means it. So some church traditions, they have a moment every week, every worship time, where they do a peace be with you moment. So real quick, I want to do this. I want you to turn to someone near you, and I want you to say, peace be with you. But I want you to really mean it. Because Jesus really means it. So I want you to give peace to somebody. Just take a few seconds and give peace to somebody. Don't come to Mike. Peace be with you, brother.
Peace be with you.